I'm Dru Stevenson, and this is a lecture for my Law and Economics seminar. This is part 3 of my introduction to property law and economics. Now, for my students, I hope that you'll watch the first 2 videos where I talk about bargaining and property values and what kind of gets built in to the current value of property. And we're talking not only about land and real estate, but also about other chattel or property securities like stocks and dividends and anything that you can actually own and sell or transact. Here we're going to be talking about a few more items that especially about property tax and how the laws of taxation and other things in locales can reflect value. So again, we're using economic insights to talk about some things like land use law and local property tax laws. So first, you may have encountered homeowners who complain about paying property taxes because the local property taxes are used largely to fund the local public schools. And so people who have no children or who homeschool their kids or who send their own kids to private schools will complain that they're having to pay for something that they get no benefit from or don't use, that they're paying for schools that other people's kids go to as if they don't have their own kids aren't in the school. But I think this is a fallacy because residential property values are heavily correlated, at least, to the quality of the local public schools. In other words, if you have a community with great schools with high rank that are highly ranked by different, according to SAT scores and things like that, an almost identical home in terms of square footage and the type of countertops and other benefits, the amount of acreage it's on, and so forth. In another community with terrible schools, so that the house in the bad school community is probably going to sell for less or be cheaper than an almost identical house in a place with really good public schools. And what that means is that taxpayer who's complaining about the having to fund the quality of the local schools is probably benefiting in terms of the appreciation value of their own home or property that they own. Now let's talk about property tax exemptions. The two big categories of these are churches and private schools. Hospitals and some other charities may also be exempt from property taxes, but the ones that take up a lot of space, to be honest, are churches and schools. And it could be a private university or a law school or a private elementary or high school. And very often they're exempt from property taxes. My students should be aware that there are usually some rules and laws about things you have to file in order to claim that, and usually you have to have already obtained your tax ID number, your nonprofit ID number from the Internal Revenue Service on the federal level, and probably from your state Department of Revenue. But not always. It varies from state to state and locale to locale. How you set up your property tax exemption from local property taxes. But here's a question to think about in terms of economics. Does this property tax exemption favor certain types of charities? In other words, the churches and schools that invest in really expensive or elaborate buildings. Remember, not all churches do. So certain denominations or religious groups actually like to have very bare bones or kind of stark or Spartan facilities, and others really like big fancy cathedrals that cost significantly more. And so if you think about where you're sticking your resources as a nonprofit, the investing in your building, if you know you have a property tax exemption, is essentially a tax-free asset. And the same goes for schools. As you probably know, some schools have rather simple, functional, and no frills facilities, and others are really elaborate and fancy, and they spent a fortune on every building. Now, so note that if we are creating a perverse incentive for churches and schools to go large on their buildings, this could come at the expense of providing other benevolent services that we use to justify their tax exemption in general, or their charitable tax status. So these nonprofits provide education to the community, or do various types of charity work, like taking care of widows, or providing drug counseling or marriage counseling, even providing religious instruction and holding services and things like that. Obviously, it doesn't benefit necessarily, if it's a church, the people outside, but some of them do. Some of them run soup kitchens and homeless shelters, and do various activities just to that are benevolent actions for the community. But remember, if they've shifted a lot of their resources into elaborate real estate and building construction, then that means that they have less to spend on these benevolent services. So I do hear people from time to time, especially on social media, say we should tax churches, but I get the feeling when they talk about this kind of glibly that they haven't thought through what type of tax we're talking about. Are we talking about corporate income tax, or are we talking about property tax? Because those are very different things, and there are very different implications of taxing or not taxing each one. Now, I've talked about that there could be a downside to this, right? It may favor certain types of churches and schools over others, but maybe there's a benefit for the community and a positive externality, because maybe it incentivizes these types of charities to evolve into permanent community institutions, right? So there are some churches that basically have their services, they rent an auditorium in a local public school, or meet in people's homes, primarily with small groups and prayer groups and Bible studies and things like that. But maybe a community, like a small town, is hoping to grow, and they want to have community institutions, like the big church on Main Street, or a beautiful school with a clock tower or something. So it could incentivize the construction of impressive local landmarks that benefit everybody, and maybe even benefit other people's property values. So now keep in mind, institutionalization of nonprofits does have downsides, because it may mean that there's some drift from the original mission of that religious organization or the school. And this could apply to universities, or could apply to elementary schools. One aspect of institutionalization is that it gets focused on self-preservation, on preserving the institution and the institution's reputation and things like that, as opposed to just kind of benefiting the constituents, right? The people that it was originally designed to help. Now, my law students have surely encountered the doctrine of takings. It's a constitutional doctrine. You may have encountered it in constitutional law or your property law course. And you probably have heard about regulatory takings, where some sort of regulation imposes a cost, or maybe even significantly diminishes the commercial value of certain types of property. And that's rolled out in 1L property courses. But now I want you to think about it a little bit more. In a lot of communities, we have things like the one where I live, a homeowners association that requires people to take care of their lawns, and puts restrictions on whether you can have like junky old cars sitting on bricks in your front yard, or what color you can paint your house, and so forth. So if you live in a community where there's a homeowners association that can kind of dictate things to you, these definitely affect your bundle of rights as much as some regulatory takings, what we might call a regulatory taking. But they actually generally increase property values, right? So if every house that you can see from my front yard also has a nicely manicured lawn and pretty landscaping, and is well kept up and so forth, and doesn't have trash laying around on the property, and so on, that it increases my property value, right? If I'm trying to sell my house and prospective buyers come, and they always look around the neighborhood, and if all the other houses in the homes in the neighborhood look really nice and have nice landscaping, and nice clean yards and so forth, it makes my house worth more on the market. We in Houston's kind of famous for not really having zoning. Most cities do have zoning. You should think about whether zoning increases or decreases property values. And my argument is it can do both. Um, let's talk about federal parklands, right? So, does a designation of, let's say, a new 1,000 acres of either federal land or state land or local land as parkland, which means it can't be developed, increase or decrease the other property values in the area? On the one hand, if you think about it, it makes the saleable property, what's available for sale on the market and for development, scarcer. And so that will usually result in an increase in prices. So maybe you want the government to designate another 1,000 acres near your home as a federal parkland or state parkland, because it means that there's less land people can buy and build homes on, which might raise the resale value of your home. On the other hand, if you're in a rural area, an area that's already rural, huge tracts being designated as protected parkland might suppress development. In other words, we're not going to have roads get put in or new housing developments and things like that. So maybe in the long term, in some circumstances, this could suppress long-term values of property. I want my students to think for a moment about licenses and permits that are tradable, like carbon emission credits, or other types of pollution permits, that are sometimes tradable on a market-based exchange. And whether there are other types of licenses and accreditations that can essentially be bought and sold, or that are a type of asset, right? So, and I'll give a pretty familiar example for students. Let's say you have a restaurant owner or somebody who owns a bar and they have a liquor license already. Well, that liquor license is valuable, and it allows them to make a certain type of revenue, and it would cost them something if they lost it. And in fact, if they were going to just kind of sell that restaurant or that bar as a turnkey operation to somebody else who could just open it tomorrow and start doing business, the fact that they already have their liquor license and other types of permits in place is a saleable value. And so I want my students to think about permits and licenses as the creation of a type of property. It's easy to think of them as a regulation that's just a restraint that imposes compliance costs on business owners. But if you think about it, there is an argument, or you could argue from an economic standpoint, that the creation of licenses and permits actually generates a type of property that's valuable, and for people to have, that then they could sell, and it might even be profitable for them. An example in the educational with higher ed is, let's say you have a standalone college or law school, and they already have full accreditation in place, and it's a lot of work to get accredited when you first start a school. Well, if they're not already affiliated with a big university, they might be attractive to a university that wants to have, let's say, a law school or a medical school. And rather than just starting their own, they're going to buy it partly to get the accreditation that's all in place, right? So you have it again, it's like the restaurant or bar, it's a turnkey operation where you already have a facility, you already have a student body, you already have some public reputation, you already have a faculty of teachers or instructors in place. Maybe you plan on replacing a lot of those people. Maybe you plan on, once you acquire this medical school or law school, standalone school or accounting school, that you are going to admit a different type of student, or maybe you're going to move it to central campus out of their current facility. That doesn't matter. It could, but it could also be that you're buying it to get the accreditation. And that concludes my third lecture on property law and economics.